So working from where we are, which is the first in a series that SOL is running on the role of horticulture in cultivating social and land equity. And we're presenting this series in partnership with Gaia College. They've been supporting a lot of our work over the last couple of years. So welcome. Thank you for coming together for this discussion. My name's Sundora Alford-Purvis, and I'm speaking to you from Ottawa, Ontario, where I live and work on unceded Algonquin lands. The shape of this series is, it's actually meant to be conversation. So today is going to be a presentation, but we're going to have pairs of sessions through this entire series where we'll first have a learning session, and then we will have a discussion. And that discussion will be taking place a couple of weeks after the initial presentation to give you a chance to sort of let it soak in. Anybody who can't make the live session to have a chance to go and watch the video, and also to go through some of the links in the material that we're providing. And that second session will be a gathering, and it's going to follow the format of a sharing circle where we can hold some space for our experiences and for exploring our reactions and our perspectives on some of the material we'll be going through over the next several months between now and April. If the group does get too large, and with the number of signups we had for even this first session in the series before it got that widely known, I think it probably will need to split. We are going to create another sort of some gatherings at some different times or on different days, and split it into some smaller circles so that we can still follow that sharing circle format. My hope is that over the next few months, we'll come to better understand each other and ourselves and begin to form some connections that will outlast this series and support each of us as we work towards cultivating more equitable communities. Today's going to be an overview. In this session, I'll work to describe the relationships that we're going to be looking at between land, ecosystems, and social equity, and to provide some guidance for those of us who are practicing in horticulture to actively engage in equity and decolonization in our own work. And while I'm speaking from a primarily white background and from settler roots, the next few sessions in this series will be centering Black and Indigenous voices. This session, or this whole series, has been a few years coming. It's been building for a while, and it's come together from a lot of sort of aha moments as things sunk in, personal experiences and frustrations, and some pretty fervent discussions. Some of you have been on the receiving end of some of my stream of consciousness soliloquies on the topics of sustainability, regeneration, exploitation, responsibility, agency, and inspiration. Thank you for lending me your ears. It's really helped get to this point. Weaving all of these thoughts and ideas together into a coherent whole has been one of the biggest challenges for me in putting this session together. I did eventually come to a narrative thread that I think it's coherent and weaves together several big issues into something that gardeners will find accessible and practical, things we can actually take and use, as opposed to sort of being big issues that are sort of hard to directly connect to. And I'm going to follow that narrative that I put together sort of from the root up to the flower. Admittedly, I'm going to trace a couple of different branches along the way. So my roots, my journey started with wonder of plants. It led to quest for sustainability and eventually brought me to a question of equity, responsibility, and relationship. It started with the magic of a giant squash plant growing from a single seed. I didn't actually like to eat squash at the time, but that didn't matter. I was hooked on growing things. Over the next few years, I checked out all of the gardening books from my small town library multiple times. I learned the names and the natures of the trees, the shrubs, and most of the wildflowers in the ecosystem where I grew up. And I saved up my allowance for trips to the garden center. I pored over catalogs and learned to grow perennials, flowers, and vegetables, other than squash, from seed. My career was also always been in horticulture. My first job wasn't babysitting or a paper route, it was gardening. My second and third jobs were in seasonal garden centers. I did take a slight or short side trip into architecture, and then I came back into horticulture as a garden center-based landscape designer. I completed my professional certification in landscape design. I moved on to a design-built landscape business. I won several awards for awards of excellence for my design work. I launched my own design company. I've started teaching landscape design at a local college. And through all of this, I've been interested in sustainability. How can the work I do result in a positive overall ecological outcome? It was a rabbit hole, and it just kept getting deeper and more complex, and I hadn't even started asking about social issues yet. The common targets of questions of sustainability in the horticulture world are lawns and peat moss, but there's a lot more things that also need to be considered. Is irrigation of established landscapes ecologically harmful or helpful overall? Mulch is good for soil health, but what about the trees and the forests that mulch is extracted from? Plants are lovely, but it's amazing how many invasive species are being sold in garden centers and to unsuspecting gardeners. Even native species are generally grown in plastic pots and peat moss-based soil in fossil fuel heated greenhouses and then shipped far away from the seed populations they originated from. And then there's hard materials: mining, manufacture, transport, waste. Where's the material going when we remove it from the site, when we demolish an existing landscape? An awful lot of that goes right to landfills, or is at best become sort of low-grade fill. Concrete pavers and retaining walls have concrete for paver and retaining walls has a high carbon footprint, but what are our alternatives? Rock is also quarried and transported, often quite long distances. Is using less good enough? Is that sustainable enough? In an industry where the narrative of what qualifies as excellence is being defined by images like this, and the picture you're seeing there is the Landscape Ontario Dunnington Grubb Award winner for 2020, and they give that award for what they consider to be the best landscaping project in Ontario for the year, and it's almost all concrete. And so when that's what landscapes are, that's what's considered landscaping excellence, there's very few people willing to discuss questions of sustainability. But I worked with what I could find. When I found resources and learning opportunities, I pursued them. I took an organic master gardening course. I took an Indigenous seed saver mentorship, a woman in permaculture design certificate course. I read books on sustainability. I went to conferences on soil regeneration. And I started to notice something. The concepts and the examples with the most solid foundation that didn't rely on dismissal of harms or externalization of costs, whether human, livestock, ecological, climate, etc., to appear sustainable, were all rooted in Indigenous knowledge and relationships. Not from a single culture or continent, but from people living in direct, long-term relationships with incredibly complex ecosystems they rely on, and caring for them with locally adapted technologies developed from a deep understanding and care-based relationship with place and community. But Indigenous voices, especially a few years ago, were not easy to find in the horticultural world. I've since come to understand that there's some very good reasons for this, having a lot to do with horticulture in its current form and practice. And we'll delve into some of the cultural reasons for that when we get to our February session. So we'll really take a deeper dive into some of these issues that are part of the reason you won't find that many Indigenous people working in horticulture. I was eventually able to find some resources, though. The book, Plants Have So Much to Give Us, All We Have to Do Is Ask, buy this book, it's a really good book, was the first book I encountered that, rather than being about how Indigenous people used plants, was by an Indigenous Anishinaabe author on relationships with plants. Through the book, Mary's genius weaves the lives of the plants and the lives of the people together through a beautiful blend of teaching stories and practical and technical information. She describes ways of being in relationship with the botanical world that had me saying, yes, this, and looking for more. Braiding Sweetgrass was next. This book's pretty famous. It's become sort of an unexpected bestseller, unexpected in the sort of mainstream sense, but the little publisher that published it has had to reprint it many times. And the audiobook is amazing. Robin Wall Kimmerer's voice draws you in as she shares stories of botanical and human relationship and interactions. Through a series of narratives, she weaves a painful history and difficult lessons with grace while teaching of relationship and responsibility and joyful reciprocity rather than of the use of plants. Again, yes, this. So how do I connect that to my day-to-day though? What would a reciprocal ecosystem relationship look like for a landscape designer? When the busy season arrives, falling back on years of patterns in designing spaces with familiar tools and expectations and design details and ways of thinking about those spaces can feel like the only way to get through everything. Just too busy. Can't always take the time to do new things and try them out and work through new problems. And a tired brain does not like to work in unfamiliar ways. I eventually decided that I needed some time and space to redesign my ways of thinking about plants and landscapes. 30 years of patterns takes some work to unweave. And so I spent a summer with the plants. Taking on a teaching position had opened up the opportunity for me to take some time away from my design work for a summer. For the first time in many years, I wasn't racing from project to project during the growing season. In addition to getting my hands back into the soil, I worked at building some new paths for my own thoughts to follow. The ways that we think are formed by the thoughts and the ideas that flow through our minds. When I want to change patterns, I seek out some different perspectives and ideas to feed into my brain. And I found books by Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee authors, two Indigenous cultural and language groups that have millennia-long relationships with the land and the ecosystems I live in and work with. I tried out some new to me practices. I looked for events that included or centered Indigenous speakers or teachers. I followed the Indigenous Seed Save course that explored relationships and responsibility toward our seed relatives and moving back into rhythms guided by natural cycles rather than clocks and calendars. But through it, I began to wonder, was gathering all this knowledge just another thing that I was taking from Indigenous people? Colonization took the land, took the children, and buried cultures. Now, as we're beginning to face predictable outcomes of taking more from land and ecosystems than they can bear, we scramble to gather Indigenous knowledge, hoping that it will save us from our folly. And socioeconomic structures make conferences and events and information resources more available to me than to many of the Indigenous people whose cultures these teachings originate from. Did I have anything to offer in return? Compounding this concern was the reality that my work was only accessible to people of certain socioeconomic situation. If they didn't have authority to make decisions about land, possess the deed, they had no need for a design for that land, much less a desire for me to impose an aesthetic creation onto existing living systems. What, as someone with a lifetime in horticulture, did I have to offer? And then it clicked. When speaking on land relationships and food sovereignty, Jose Tucros described the challenges that Indigenous people in urban spaces have in accessing land for ceremony, gathering medicines, and growing food. More than half of the Indigenous people who live within the borders of what's currently Canada live in urban settings but have little or no access to green space for their own use or activities. Horticulture in one way or another, influences how land is cared for and shaped in almost all urban green spaces. We set expectations, we provide the materials, the services, the plants, and the products that flow into those spaces. Years ago, I came across the phrase, all design is ecological design, one way or another. It resonated with me. Whether or not we intend for our decisions to affect the health of ecosystems we work in and draw from, they do. One way or another, our decisions do affect those systems. Now I'm beginning to see that all work is social work, one way or another. We are either upholding and reinforcing existing systems, or we're actively altering them in some way. Pardon me while I grab a drink, because I'll lose my voice if I go the whole time without having something. Landscaping is in a precarious position. The industry is in a precarious position. The existing system of landscaping, shouldn't have paused, I broke my rhythm. The existing system of landscaping as an industry is in a very precarious position. As with most types of work and aspects of society at the moment, disruption is on the horizon. As the climate continues to shift, extreme rainfall will necessitate more permeable cities with far less paving and concrete. And the legislation around this is already waiting in the wings in Ontario. They've done the research. The insurance industry is pressuring for it to come through. Sooner or later, the costs are going to get so high that they're going to go ahead and implement this. And your urban spaces are going to have to maintain a certain degree of permeability, which means more soft space. We're having increasingly extreme drought conditions, and that's going to lead to limits on the use of water in ornamental landscapes. Loss of critical species will put pressure on the sale of invasive species and on the planting of exotic and monoculture landscapes. Restrictions on nitrous oxide, which is an extremely potent greenhouse gas, will lead to the limiting or elimination of the use of non-organic source nitrogen fertilizers in organic landscapes. Phosphorus fertilizers are already facing restrictions in many places due to runoff and water contamination. The carbon released from mining peat bogs and extracting forestry products will drive up the costs or place restrictions on their consumption for ornamental landscapes. Legal protections for agricultural soils will make buying a load of earth much more expensive undertaking if it's an option at all. Change is coming. While landscaping faces those climate-related challenges, the places we import much of our fresh food from are coming under more extreme climate pressures. California fires, salination of Florida's groundwater as sea level rises, depletion of the aquifers in the middle of the continent we rely on for some of the crops that we import into Canada. As this year has shown, when we're worried, we plant food. We should also be composting, but we're not all there yet, but compost. Change is coming. The work of shaping our landscapes to picture perfect form and color with clean lines and low maintenance beds of non-native species that don't get chewed on by many or any native beings. It's going to go away in the next couple of decades as the world changes one way or another. I'd rather we were proactive about this. At the same time, gardening as an activity is experiencing resurgence. More people are reconnecting with the plants and the systems that surround and feed us. Growing food is a way to regain agency and connection with the world as we know it, regain connection with the world as the world we know it is becoming uncertain. As this year's shown, when we don't feel safe, we grow food, but opportunity to grow food is not equally available. Access to green space, to the land to grow food is far from consistent across socioeconomic and race spectrums. Those with the fewest economic resources to ride out the rising food costs have the least opportunity to grow food for themselves. This is partially rooted in the laws and social structures that permitted and enforced the exploitation of Black and Indigenous farmers. The history of sharecropping in the United States is fairly widely known, if not in detail, at least the system existed. In Canada, the history of the permit system, which prohibited Indigenous communities from selling any of their agricultural products or even purchasing farming equipment without explicit permission from the local Indian agent. It's less well known, and that permission was almost never given. Crops were purchased by the Indian office at half or less of the going rate in most cases, and it was illegal for the Indigenous people to sell to the general public. We made profit off of this, and it was actually done because the assumption was that Indigenous people would not be effective farmers, and so it was just a good and another additional way to get rid of them. And then they proved to be better farmers than the settlers, and they were outdoing them, so they had to put an end to that. As the trauma of these and other exploitations succeeded in driving a wedge between the people who were forced to live through the traumas and the relationship with working with soil to grow food and make a livelihood. With the resurgence and the reclamation of Black and Indigenous cultures and increasing demands for food sovereignty and land back, more and more marginalized people are breaking through the shaming narratives around agriculture and land-based work. In returning to land-based relationships with plants, food, and medicine, these same people are also bringing back practices that came from different roots than the colonial industrial agriculture that currently dominates the majority of arable land on Turtle Island. The principles that are often framed as originating in permaculture, biodynamics, and organics are almost all drawn from Indigenous knowledge and practices on various continents, although many have been removed from the relationship with the original ecosystem and culture. At places like Soulfire Farm and Silvanaka, these practices of cultivation are laying the foundation for restoring ecological health, creating equitable access to food and land, and practicing alternative forms of livelihood and ownership structures. The contrast between the work being done by BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, farmers, and cooperatives, and the conventional agriculture system that currently holds the majority of land highlight the reality that too often, those of us with the most power to make decisions about land are also the most generations removed from living in rooted reciprocal relationships with land, of depending directly on the health and the vitality of the land for our own health and vitality. Conventional agriculture and horticulture practices treat land and the ecosystems that exist on that land as property that can be altered in any way we choose, whether for profit or whim. In her book, Gathering Moss, Robin Wall Kimmerer explores this in the chapter The Owner. It's a much less famous book, but it's actually quite a good read as well, and it also comes in an audiobook. Excellent books. The land and the ecosystems, we do not treat them as if they have inherent rights of existence. And the outcomes of this type of relationship of exploitative practices are becoming increasingly visible. The California, Oregon, and Washington fires, like the Australia fires earlier this year, have many people saying that we need to relearn Indigenous burning practices. What I haven't seen much of are serious suggestions that the land needs to be returned entirely to Indigenous management, as if burning can be simply extracted from the Indigenous practices, separated out from a complex system that it existed within, and inserted into colonial land exploitation and still be effective. And even if that was possible, what would be owed for the knowledge of the burning practices? They were developed over millennia. What's the value of that kind of research and development? Something like the value of corn and potatoes are the two other outcomes of eons of care and relationship that have been commodified. If we try to save ourselves by extracting and commodifying Indigenous knowledge, we're building on the same framework of exploitation that the land's currently suffering under. We know that the knowledge and the practices that we need to help heal the planet are held by people who often have been pushed to the margins. Indigenous peoples hold 25% of the world's land surface and steward about 80% of the remaining global biodiversity. Black farmers who have historically been the backbone of the American agricultural system, making up a fifth of farmers and a quarter of ranch hands a century ago, the cowboys were Black. And having a history of a high degree of agricultural success, now only hold 0.52% of agricultural land. Those of us who currently hold the majority of the power to make decisions about land, plants, and ecosystems need to relearn the practice of reciprocal regenerative relationship with the ecosystems we are part of. But most of all, we need to take a good hard look at the colonial narrative that states that land and ecosystems can be dominated and formed for our profit and comfort, and how a certain amount of exploitation is just how things work. If we don't question the worldview that led us to our current situation, if we adopt regenerative grazing while still excluding the native grazers and predators from the land, or indigenous burn traditions while continuing to cut swaths through forests, we're setting ourselves up and global ecosystems up for further collapse. Rather than bringing healing and regeneration, we're manipulating systems to extend the productive life without getting to the underlying issues. The change we need to cultivate is in the relationship that we base our decisions and actions on, rather than simply adopting specific practices. And it's in horticulture too. Exploitative relationships don't only exist in agricultural or rural spaces. The largest nurseries that grow the majority of plants for the horticultural industry rely on the same seasonal worker programs as the agricultural sector. The programs that have recently become the focus of media attention due to the spread of COVID through the cramped conditions of the workspaces and the employer-provided housing, but that also have deeper issues around worker mobility, physical safety, and pay rates. The history of reliance on exploited labor underlies the colonial history of this continent. It continues to be the basis of the food system and the large-scale wholesale nursery trade. Issues around exploitation in horticulture aren't restricted to labor and the extraction of materials from earth and from ecosystems. Biocolonialism and biopiracy, the taking of plants from place in relationship without permission from or credit or compensation to the people who have tended the ecosystems being explored, have a deep history in agriculture, and it's now beginning to be recognized in the horticultural world. Oh, by the way, everything that's underlined, those are all links. So it's links to further stories. So when you go through the slides later, you too can go down many rabbit holes on these topics. When we are ready to start to do some of the work that comes first is at the core of Indigenous teachings around land and plants is the concept that relationships are more important than specific techniques, plants, or products. The same applies to human systems and communities. Whether we're talking about equality or reconciliation, the work that comes first is cultivation of relationships. Those of us who are working from settler backgrounds often don't start off with good tools for cultivating strong, flexible, diverse, reciprocal relationships. We generally start off with the tools that create the social landscape and ecological disconnection that we're hoping to fix. To be in relationship is to be influenced by those we're in relationship with. Cultivating relationship isn't a simple matter of inviting groups that have historically been excluded into our space. Spaces need to evolve into something that is inclusive of everyone and reflects complex diversity. Sometimes creating equity also means ensuring that resources are available for groups to create their own spaces. So not about bringing people in, but about spreading resources out. The story of the last few centuries of history on Turtle Island is one of genocide, exploitation, displacement, and erasure. The severing of relationship to land, ecosystem, and communities is also a trauma that most of us have in our family histories within the last few generations. We're all woven into this cloth in a variety of roles, and unpacking that history can be painful. Unpacking how that history is expressed and experienced in the present is often disturbing and traumatizing. Many of us who have become aware of these realities well into our adult lives find ourselves ill-prepared without good toolkits for working through the grief, anger, dissonance, and pain of realizing that our world isn't what we were taught it was. It's also difficult to succeed in the work of unpacking that experience without a network of people who are on similar journeys. That's part of the purpose of the discussion sessions, to provide some space to work through the mucky stuff so we have a better chance of succeeding in the important work of weaving new patterns and setting new foundations for our relationships with the land, ecosystem, and community. When we start to try to make connections across social, race, or economic divides, we sometimes find that entering a space where the power structures are inverted from what many of us are used to can be disorienting. A common reaction is to defend our rights to be in a space by proving that we are knowledgeable or woke, that despite settler roots or light-colored skin, we really do belong. These are behaviors and our actions learned from coping within the types of power and social structures we're often trying to escape from when we go looking for alternatives to the current dominant culture. I'm speaking from experience. Practice accepting a space at the back or at the edge. Listen and learn and keep showing up. Hold some internal space for information or ideas that are jarring. There's no need to make snap judgments about new information that conflicts with our personal experiences or perspectives. Don't skip the foundational work. Urgency, changing things right now can feel so important when so many things are going so wrong. But if changes are built on unsustainable patterns, they're almost always set up to fail in the long run. Rushing is also when we tend to take the most shortcuts and cause the most collateral harms because of lack of understanding of the system we're rushing into. Changing the world is sometimes a matter of what we say or what actions we take. Other times it's a question of listening and making space for others to act without pressures to fit within the existing structures, expectations, or norms. Don't add to people's work. When we're cultivating understanding, asking is good for specifics, why or how about a place, a project, or an action. For generalities, especially ones that would put the work of explaining structural issues or proving that something is harmful or racist onto the person experiencing that harm, remember that there's a universe of information available at the nearest screen. We don't need to make them do the work. The work's already been done. We just have to go looking for the knowledge, the framing, the background. It's all out there and it's easy to find. Also ask where some things come from. There's a lot of people out there who will offer Indigenous or Native or shamanic teachings about various things. But beware of people offering Indigenous teachings if they don't also share the lineage of what it is they're selling. Teachings are easily distorted, intentionally or otherwise, when they're severed from their roots. The understanding of who has the right to hold or share knowledge in the stories can be quite different in different cultures. This is a vast oversimplification, but it's one I found helpful to keep in mind as I've been sort of learning more about Indigenous perspectives, especially on Turtle Island. It's good to keep in mind that anything created by nature, such as land, air, water, plants, seeds, animals, humans, are beings unto themselves and are not something that can be owned. Anything created by humans, art, ideas, knowledge, songs, some, not all, stories can be held in the possession of the people who created them and are not free to be copied or shared without explicit permission. Most Indigenous teachers will share the story of how they came to hold their teaching and on what basis they're sharing them. When the time does come for action, we have the most capacity to create change within our own sphere of influence and expertise. By shifting from patterns of colonization and domination in human relationships with the landscape, we can create patterns of decolonization that flow into other aspects of our lives. By practicing reciprocity and care in our work, we can create physical examples of decolonization in the urban landscapes where the majority of people now spend the majority of our lives. We can create visual examples of decolonization where people can interact with them. Practice gratitude. The action of practicing gratitude is a reciprocal gift that's often spoken of by Indigenous teachers. Gratitude is a gift that changes both the recipient and the giver. We value and protect what we're grateful for. When we are feeling gratitude, we're less likely to be frantically seeking the next thing. And gratitude helps us recognize when we have enough and don't need more. If you're looking for a practice of gratitude, the words before all else are a practice that was created by the Haudenosaunee people and has been gifted to the world. And you may be familiar with that as the Thanksgiving address. There's a link, there's a whole document on it. And it's a good practice if you're just seeking a practice of gratitude to start with. Offer attention. Attention is also a gift that changes the giver. Take the time to get to know the life that we interact with. Where do your plants come from? Both the individuals and their ancestors. Who did they live in relationship with before they came to your garden? Do any of those relationships continue to exist within their new home? Can you restore them if they don't? Who was historically in relationship with the land that you're working with? The people, the birds, the animals, yes, but also the plants and the tiny beings that live in complex relationship with them. Are they living and thriving now? If they aren't, can you help to change that? Can you collaborate with the plants to nurture a thriving ecosystem? Question the assumptions. Most of us have inherited a system that for generation upon generation has relied on expansion and extraction, and we're surrounded by the persistent reinforcement of the narrative that this is necessary, that it's part of what it is to be human. Daniel Quinn describes the creation of this narrative as the Great Forgetting. There's a link. The pattern of endless expansion is a cultural creation, something that Jack D. Forbes describes as the Wetiko disease, a contagion of endless consumption that it eats all life. There's many ways of being that are not built up off of this foundation of consumption. Gardening can be a physical act of colonization through the removal of native species and soil and their replacement with alternatives that are tractable, familiar, managed, maintained, constrained, tidied, and predictable. Gardening can also be a radical act of decolonization and cultivation of relationship. The colonial version of gardening is what most of us are introduced to when we first experience the urge to weave even small connections to plants and land back into our lives. Many of us have never had a chance to learn what a healthy and thriving system looks like, sounds like, and feels like. We're taught that a well-cared for garden is one that is neat and tidy. We don't see the relationships are missing because we haven't seen or experienced them. We don't know that there's anything to miss. Those of us already working in horticulture actually have the opportunity to change this. I've been moving more and more towards planting and nurturing native species, not from a racial purity standpoint, which can be surprisingly common in certain native species circles, but because I know, or I don't know. The whole of science doesn't know enough about the relationships that plants form with the macro and microbiome, all the critters that we see and don't see, to be confident that a species from far away can form the same strong reciprocal relationships with the life that can only live in this space that I'm working with. Not everything can go somewhere else to follow when the plants are moved. I want to do what I can in my own small way to support the systems of life, to practice reciprocity within the systems that have supported my life and livelihood. Add life rather than removing it. There tend to be a lot of holes in the ecosystems of most urban landscapes. They're not, if you look at a garden, some are very full, but a lot of them, the ground layer is actually not filled in. There's also often opportunity for more up above. So just like cultivating a healthy relationship with food, it's less about removing specific items than it is about focusing on adding more whole and healthy foods. Decolonizing the landscape is less about ripping out the introduced species than it is about filling in all the spaces in our minimized landscapes with life-supporting species. You aren't buying more plants, you're decolonizing the landscape. A common reason offered for planting non-native species is that native species often don't thrive in urban conditions. Rarely is the responsibility for their failure to thrive placed on what went into creating those conditions. Even less common is making a real effort to restore the health of urban spaces to the point that a diversity of native species can thrive within them. The same can be said about human systems. The creation of reconciliation and equity isn't just about inviting previously excluded people into our spaces. Systems, structures, and normal are built and defined by the people and cultures that occupy a space. The structures that surround us are often so familiar that they can assume a neutral state in our minds, becoming invisible unless we actively look for and question them or they're pointed out to us. In David Foster Wallace's now famous commencement speech, he shared the parable. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over the shore at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" We don't always see what our space is made up of because it's so familiar. Simply opening up a space without consideration for whether that space is in itself capable of being inclusive leads to other issues and conflicts. We gave them a chance, but they can't hack the work. They just aren't a good fit for the team. We let them in and they're still not happy. Now they expect us to change to make them happy and comfortable and feel safe. I've heard all of these things over the years. Don't wait to be asked. Rather than focusing on individual accommodations, look for what is making the space, that can be the industry, the garden, the community plot, unwelcoming in the first place. Structures, behaviors, conflicting values and priorities. What are the barriers that are preventing people from creating their own spaces that meet their own needs? If it's not a good fit space, do you change it or do you ensure that there's resources available so that people can build a space that suits them? That's also equity.
I got potatoes.
Pardon? No. When we fit well into the existing culture, we don't put the work of questioning the culture on others, or don't put the work of questioning the culture on others. Look for the water. There's no shortage of information and materials available about equity and inclusion. There's articles, books, videos, and published studies about race, culture, allyship, and bias easily available online and through the public library system. Even better, buy books and take paid courses by authors and teachers who are Indigenous, Black, or people of color. Our choices also extend beyond our spaces. When it comes to physical aspects of our work, especially when we're bringing products or materials into a space, pause to consider, where did it come from and how was it grown, processed, or created? What happens with it once it no longer fills the role that it's being placed into? And who will be affected by this? Where does it come from? Who made it? How was it extracted? How did that extraction affect people's lives, affect ecosystems? There's lots of questions to ask, and they are rabbit holes, but they're questions that if we don't start asking them, we're not going to get to a place where we actually have a sustainable reciprocal system and business or life or community to work from. Do our work first. And I'm saying that as a white lady. We so often want to rush in and fix problems for other people and in other spaces where we see them, often causing more harm in the long run. I asked a question of the class that I teach, which is in a horticulture program, of things that were being done in horticulture that were ecologically harmful and things that could be done that were not, that to actually undo ecological harms. And I kid you not, half the responses came back as being something to do with agriculture. People were really quick to critique the other industry without the attention on our own. And this is where we can make the biggest change. The big problems are all supported by small patterns. They can be undermined by changing those same small patterns. In her book, Emergence Strategy, Adrienne Marie Brown describes the system as being fractal. If we change the small patterns, new larger patterns will naturally start to emerge. We can practice this in the garden. Gardens can be great spaces to learn to notice the joyful, vibrant, thriving complexity that comes of many different beings living and growing together. They can also be a place to practice responsiveness, adaptation, patience, joy, and gratitude. It's valuable to work on changing patterns of rushing, of not noticing, and of interruptions in relationship that make bonds fragile. Purchasing new seed every year breaks the connection between a successful season for the gardener and a successful season for the plants. When we honor the connection between the plants caring for us and our caring for the plants, we cultivate a relationship. I found that practicing a relationship of care with the garden and the plants has added a new facet to my gardening. Plants live to grow and share seeds. One of the gifts I can offer to them in return for all of the gifts that they've shared with me is to help care for and distribute their seeds. Fall cleanup has been replaced by fall gathering. Poring over catalogs in January has been replaced with sorting, cleaning, and labeling packets of seeds to share. Other gardeners on receiving the seeds from the plants that I care for are also very happy with this new development. Also practice care within our existing circle. This is where we do our practice. Don't rush out and buy indigenous seeds. A good comparison on this would be when good white families adopted Indian children as a charitable act. Many indigenous communities are only now reuniting with their seed relatives following centuries of disruption and displacement. Respect the relationships. Businesses that promote indigenous seeds and traditional medicine, often without naming the community that they came from or the people who have carried them, like Baker Creek and Richter's Herbs, have very different relationships in indigenous seed storing communities than in the wider horticultural world. Rather than kidnapping more plant relatives, we can practice by caring for the seeds we already hold or that we've forgotten to care for in the generations between our own indigenous or peasant roots and our current lives. Some thoughts to close with. We are inheritors of a system of colonization, but we do not need to be defenders of that system. To work towards equity, actively seek out the voices of those who have been pushed to the margins. Bring curiosity, practice listening, and offer attention. Stick with it. The process of unpacking long-held perceptions will be unfamiliar work for many of us. We'll stumble and sometimes feel disoriented and anxious outside of the familiar and the comfortable. Acknowledge this, hold some space for the uncomfortable and the scary. Expect to screw up. Accept the feedback when it happens. Do better next time, but keep showing up. Far too often, when times get tough or change takes too long, allies fade away. If you want to be seen as reliable, trustworthy, and willing to do the work, be reliable, trustworthy, and do the work. Even the slow work, the boring work, and the work that just feels like it's incremental. If that's what you're in the role of doing or you're asked to do the work. Expect to grieve. At some point, you'll likely discover that something or someone that you love or respect has an ugly side or an ugly history. Your personal experience may not reflect this because your position or perspective is different. That doesn't mean that someone with a different experience or perspective is wrong or a liar or needs to stop pointing out difficult and uncomfortable things. It isn't the responsibility of the victim or the survivor to help us work through our grief and anger. That's the role of our support network, and part of the reason that cultivating this network is important. Take the time and space to grieve beliefs or relationships that have come to an end. Really practice. Changing culture isn't something that we'll achieve overnight. It isn't a destination, it's a journey. A cycle of growth and rest, of pushing through and allowing space. Gentle persistence. That's been my catchphrase for some time now. It's gently persistent. Rest when needed. Burnout culture is another pattern of exploitation that many of us have internalized. Simply practicing joy and gratitude for simple things and the successes of others can be a decolonial and radical act, one that heals from the inside and outside. Nurture. Get to know and nurture more plants. Work with them to nurture soil and ecosystems. Get to know and nurture more people. Work with them to nurture community. Share, celebrate, repeat. And let me turn off my screen share. So that's my talk. Christine, do you want to come back in?
I'm unmuted now. So
Okay.
I was monitoring the chat box for questions and comments, but there aren't any right now. So if anybody has a question that they would like, if you could please put it in written form in the comments, or if need be, you can also send a motion and I can unmute you. But if
I think people can unmute themselves. So if you have a question, please go ahead and ask.
Yeah, any comments on the chat as well? Some people have just commented to thank you and say it was wonderful and inspiring.
Anyone else? I just bowled you all over with so much info that I'm just going to turn off my camera so that I can actually turn on my Zoom camera.
So there's one question actually, so from Kathy to everybody, well, to this forum, and that is, are the slides available after the talk? So yes, they are. They'll be sent out in a link, the whole slideshow with those embedded links to go down that rabbit hole, as Sandora was saying.
Yes, as I talked, I noticed there's a couple more links I can add as I go too. So it'll come with a few extra links. So there will be no shortage of rabbit holes to explore. Anyone else? I've just overloaded everybody with too much information in one go. There's some nodding heads here.
Well, maybe Sandora, this would be a good opportunity for you to talk about the next session, that everybody who's on this webinar today has an invitation, and we hope you will join in the next session. But maybe Sandora, you could explain it a bit more.
Yeah. So through the, I in addition to that seed save, of course, I did through with Rowan White and the links in there. I would also had the opportunity to take a mentorship course that she offered to sort of a group of people who had taken that seed save, of course. And as part of that, one of the things we did was we actually had these circles where there would either be a question asked or sort of a check-in. People were invited to also bring anything that they wanted to sort of share with the group. And it didn't have to be a question or a big project or something to solve. It often was just like, where are you at internally on some of this, but it could also be, I'm working on this project and I have all these ideas. It was whatever people wanted to bring. And I found that portion ended up being really important for starting to form relationships, so that it wasn't just somebody talking to the group. It helped start to bring the group together and to build some connections, and also gave some space to actually work through the process of internalizing some of the lessons and sort of moving them from being just sort of academic or intellectual exercises into being things that actually helps set some of our paths over the last several months, and hopefully we'll be reconnecting again in the winter once we're all back from our gardens. So I'm hoping to copy that experience and share it on with you by having these gatherings afterward, and I put them a couple of weeks away because I know not everybody can make it to the live sessions. So there'll be time for people to see the video and also to think about things for a little while, and also to go through some of the additional information. And then we can start to reconnect, because connections are really the thing that's going to get us somewhere. And I see things popping up.
So there is a question. Have you noticed that there is a growing community amongst landscape designers to tune into the land, to sense, feel, and then ask how the land would like to be in co-creative process? That's from Kat Gibson.
I don't know if that's been happening, but it would be lovely if it did. Maybe by the end of this, we'll have a few more people who are.
Are there any concrete landscape designs that we can start pointing to and sharing. I mean, I work with the, you know, the Master Gardeners Forum, and often get so many questions from the public about, you know, they want recipes, which is tough in that kind of a forum to kind of give quick answers to rather complex questions. And I'm looking for things to help shift attitudes and examples that people can learn from in that kind of a forum. I'm hoping that that might be touched upon here.
I wish it was that simple, but I've been working as a landscape designer for, like, I have to add it up, it's probably about 18 years now. It's been my core profession, and I'm starting to feel more and more like even designs custom made for a site are still, they're still not responsive enough. They are still, even when made with the best of intention, and so I'm critiquing my own work here, going, with the best of intention, they don't have the flexibility through time and the adaptability, and they also, the whole process doesn't tend to offer enough time to get to know the site, even when it's spread out over, even if it's a course of a year, the site also evolves. And so that's actually something I've been thinking about, that I think rather than a design or recipes, we actually, it's going to become about practice, the practice of being in a relationship. And so it's not a recipe. And unfortunately, I think
I absolutely agree with you. And the question is, you know, how do it, you know, as an educator, as a teacher, how do we try and teach or give the tools to learn about creating this reciprocal relationship, to, you know, how to start looking at ecosystems, to look at people and see things differently. I mean, it's very transformative. I think your talk was truly inspiring. It's now trying to figure out how do we implement it in a pragmatic way with the public that I work with constantly, and trying to find the words to inspire people to do just what you say. And that's thank you.
I have literally bought copies of Braiding Sweetgrass and Plants Have So Much to Give Us, and like given them out to the community, because these two authors between them, I think, have done so much to put the narrative in that direction of, it's about relationship, and they both do it in a very beautiful way that totally engages the plant geeks among us. So they're actually really good books to read. And Robin Wall Kimmerer, I love her audiobooks. They're just really engaging. So I think it's more about introducing the idea that it's a long process, but it's actually a really awesome process because you get to know it and you get engaged. And I think probably what it'll end up becoming, and I really am thinking about some of these things too, because a friend who runs a business that is in the horticultural world is looking at leasing some land where they want to start they work with refugees, among other things, and they're going to be growing some local, or some of the foods that they can't easily get from grocery stores, because the various ethnic vegetables that I'm using her description of, but the vegetables that they can't get here, and they're really frustrated about that, or the quality is not what, and they were the people growing them in the countries they came from, so they know how to grow them. So they're doing that, but she also is going to be starting a native plant nursery on the site, and I'm working with her on that part, and I'm also going to work to develop sort of the display garden or the example spaces through a series of courses, so that people can come and sort of, okay, you take a day and then you come back in a month, and you take a day and you come back in a month and you take a day, and sort of follow things over time through how do we work with the soil, and then how do we get the young ecosystem going, and then how do we add things as it matures as an ecosystem, because I think people need examples and they need spaces to do it. But I also think that once people get engaged, they're like really geeky excited about it, and it's fun and it's neat, and it's like, wow, look at this. It's sort of like the first time somebody harvests their own tomato and then they're like hooked for life. It is that, but it does need more support around it, just because that's what I sort of talked about, and that's not what the industry looks like right now, and it's also not the version of gardening that people are offered when they start gardening. So That's
Okay.
the work that we need to do.
Okay, well, I just, in the interest of time,
Mhm.
I will just go to another question. It sort of comes in a few different, like a sentence, paragraph form. There is an argument by botanists from Harvard and so on who argue that given climate change, hanging on to native species is ill-advised and that we need to experiment as much as possible with plants and trees that might be able to withstand dramatically changed urban conditions and new drainage patterns, etc. that will be very soon that we will very soon be experiencing. What are your thoughts on this way of thinking about plant materials?
So I have a couple of thoughts about it. One is I do think we're going to have to help plants walk north because the climate is walking north faster than the plants can walk themselves north. And I think we're going to need to assist them with that. And that's something we have the capacity to do for them. I think some of those things around the drainage patterns that are being argued about and the urban conditions, that's bad design on our part. And then we're using that, that's that thing about the urban conditions, we are creating unsustainable and almost unlivable conditions, and then we're blaming the plants for not living in them. So what do we do to actually fix the conditions? Because the plants that are brought from too far away, because some of the other stuff, some of the life that exists with those plants that we need to walk north is going to come north as well. It's more mobile than the plants are. And by bringing it north, we're actually helping support some of the lives. Not everything's going to be effectively able to move north because you've got different day length patterns and all these other things that are going to come in and be factors. But if we're going to go and we're going to get something from southern China and move it over here, it's not going to have the right chemical makeup for most of the things to be able to eat at the foliage stage. And lots of plants will, lots and lots of plants produce flowers that pollinators in general the nectar feeders can feed off of. But where the cycle gets broken is that they don't have leaves that the larvae of those creatures can feed on. So if it doesn't have foliage that can support the native species, all it's doing is we're using those plants as infrastructure in our urban spaces. We're not actually considering the ecological outcomes. And often we do a poor job of evaluating whether or not those plants are going to become invasive beyond the urban sites we're going to use them in. So we've got lots of plants here. There's lots of plants on this continent. There are so many plants we haven't even considered for the nursery trade yet. Or even made an effort to select more resilient versions of that might do, or ones that are adapted to urban spaces. We don't need to be bringing more things from other continents. We need to be dealing with the reasons that the ones from this continent are dying.
So thank you. So Astrid is wondering, is a subsequent session a discussion about this talk? And so Sandora, she's explained, yes, the next session is more participatory where everyone will have a chance to have the discussion together about this particular presentation that we've had today.
Yes, although we're somewhat flexible on it. If you come in, you go, well, I saw that talk and it made me think of this thing and this was really cool. And I went and I looked down this rabbit hole. That's fine too. It's to sort of bring what your experience was from this and sort of the things that came out of it, or where you're at, or even, hey, this is where I'm coming from. And this is kind of all weird and I'm just getting used to it, but I'll keep coming. That's also an acceptable thing to bring to the circle. So it's not heavily formal. I'm hoping this will work out. I'm sort of first time trying it in this type of a setting, but as I said, it was sort of really something that I felt helped make the experience from going through that mentorship course really sink in, and it also helped create some connections that continued to be well beyond the end of the session or that series.
All right, so a question from David in BC, I think. So place is certainly one of the areas that we all are thinking about. What have you learned about place and its meaning for you?
Well, it's sort of funny because the first time I really ran into the thing of being called a settler, I had sort of a visceral reaction to that because it wasn't about, well, I'm a Canadian. It was, but this is my ecosystem. I grew up in this ecosystem. I've shifted a little bit east, but place for me is about the landscape that's there and the ecosystem that's there and the life that's there. And one of the things, and I pointed out that one Landscape Ontario project in the talk that had won the big award. And I do see the Landscape Ontario posts on Facebook when they sort of share the various award winners over the course of the year. Then they're all awarded at once, but they promote them at different points. And I had this game of Spot the Hydrangea, and I don't think I've lost it once so far this year. Every landscape has a hydrangea, and my students hear from me, cedars, boxwoods, ornamental grasses, hydrangeas, and yews, and there's a couple of other things, but they're in almost every one. To me, that's actually annihilation of place. We change the shape of it, we change the things that grow there, we can change out the soil. Place is, okay, what's here? Is it well? Can I help it be well? Is there anything else I can do for it? We tend to, as an industry, overwrite space more than respond to it. And that's something that I think is because we're in a hurry. We don't actually have the time. When I'm saying this as a designer who did designs for years and years and years, you come in, you look around it and you go, okay, well, what do you want to do with it? And then we just turn it into that. And we don't spend a lot of time getting to know it. And we do that because we're in a hurry. And I think to have space really be space that is responded to, we have to slow down, and whoever is going to make the decisions about that space needs to get to know it. And that takes time, and there's no shortcuts there. I'm seeing a bunch of questions.
Well, another one, well, a comment actually also from David is, it's a question, where are the men in this discussion? And I guess it's in this discussion or in this profession. I guess it's both of that. Any comment that you have about that?
It's sort of funny because in reading various books, and actually one of them was that I mentioned it, Emergent Strategy. And through that book, Emergent Strategy, the topic of like ecofeminism and you know, feminist, and I'm kind of one of those people who's like, but the guys can play, and then I keep sort of having these spaces where just naturally it's like the guys aren't showing up, and I'm like, damn it, you're matching the stereotype. Would you stop it? Where are the guys? Invite them. There's nothing that we've talked about that the guys can't be doing. I do think that there's a chunk of the industry that will never change, but I also think, I wasn't kidding when I said change is coming for this industry. I actually want to save all the people who actually want to work with land and pull them into a new version of the industry. This is sort of a bigger overarching project. So I want there to be, instead of landscaping, land care. And I think we need a whole bunch of people working in it because it's work that is actually good for people. And it's also going to help us work with the spaces to help them be well through these really traumatic times that are coming with the climate, with the shifting climate and all these things that nature is going to have to survive. We're going to have to do a lot of work to help that. That's work I want to be doing. And I think a lot of people want to be doing that work if we can figure out how. And I think we actually have a lot of the hows, and now it's a matter of creating our community around it so that we can all support each other, which there's an interesting project, a couple of interesting projects coming together here in Ottawa where there's much more cooperative format, and that it is still mostly women in that too, but not entirely. So we can build different environments and start to weave it together. And the men can join, the men will join when they see that we're all over here having fun and making money.
Yeah, okay. So there's a thank you for some simultaneously gentle and challenging wisdom. When you have this conversation with people who don't agree with you or don't want to hear what you're saying, have you found ways to keep the conversation going and to keep engaging?
So there's different facets of it that some people, it's funny because I've talked to a few landscapers. I was hoping to actually pull together an Indigenous Knowledge and Horticulture Symposium here in Ottawa this summer, and COVID. And I told a few landscapers about it, and be amazed how many went, oh, that sounds really cool. This isn't about going, oh, you're all horrible. there are some things, and I put it in this context because also we're going to have speakers coming in who are Black and who are Indigenous and who are going to talk about these things. And I wanted to lay some groundwork to go, this isn't their work to teach us about this history. Let's actually look at the stuff they're working on now. I wanted to work that in. You can start with just the conversation about the resilient systems, and here's all this potential for work that can be done that is actually going to employ a lot more people and require a lot less product moving around, which means greater frontline employment. And we just need to get people excited about it, which when you start to talk to people about, hey, there's this thing you can do that's going to actually help resolve or help address some of these huge, overwhelming problems that we're dealing with, and you also get flowers, people get excited about that and want to actually be part of it. So there are going to be people who are resisting, but I actually find I put most of my attention on the ones who are interested in engaging. I'm not trying to change the people who don't want to change. I'm trying to create a space or a network for all the people who want to come into something different, because I think there's a lot of people who want to and just haven't had the opportunity to take time off work and go to conferences and read all the books and think about it. So I'm kind of going, okay, let's do this. And there are people who are starting to join in, and that's just been the last few months of sort of trying to work at building a network here in Ottawa. And if it all comes together in Ottawa, I'll write up a bunch of information and go, okay, everyone else, this is what worked here. Here's some tips. Go make a group in your space.
Okay, there's a question about language from Joyce. How do you think language affects our ability to form relationships? Robin Wall Kimmerer says English is a noun-based language, somehow so appropriate to a culture so obsessed with things. Only 30% of English words are verbs, but in Potawatomi, that proportion is 70%.
It's funny, I actually had a little chunk which ended up sort of being cut because it didn't fit smoothly into the narrative about language. So English is, what do we say? Only 30% verbs, but if you actually counted up the sheer number of verbs we have, there's probably more verbs in English than there are in Potawatomi. English is a massive language. It's like the biggest one out there. The sheer number of words, we can choose which ones to use and how we choose to use them. A word I have been trying to get out of my vocabulary is property. We talk about land, we literally call it property. It's in our lexicon, and we say property more often in our culture than we actually say the word land when we're describing the spaces that we have authority over in some way, shape, or form. We talk about it as property. We don't have to keep doing that. We can choose to change our own language use. And the other side of that is, it's if we come at it with the attitude of exploitation and dominance, we could take Potawatomi and turn it into an exploitative language. So we could actually, and we can, if we choose to, take English and use it to be a language about reciprocity and care and sustainability. And we can do that with English. We don't have to go and learn another language. It's kind of like the thing with the seeds. We don't have to go and find the seeds of the other group. We can take care of the ones that come from our own circle. Because we can practice that relationship of care, and we can practice language we can practice language in different ways. And part of the reason I did a lot more reading on this presentation than I generally do on presentations is because I worked on that language. It takes practice to change language. But we can change our use. We don't have to switch languages. Is that enough info for everyone? Have I overloaded? Okay. Yeah.
That's it for the questions. So.
Anyone have anything else? So I'll get the video posted and get that shared out Possibly tomorrow. I'll see how tomorrow goes and how everything processes and uploads. If not tomorrow, then I'll get it posted and shared sort of early next week. And I'll also I will get the slideshow at the very least put onto the website, the same web page where you would have gone and read about this event. I'll put it right on there, and the links will be active, so you can go through and click on any of those. If you're like, she said that thing and had a link, and I know there's more information there, you can click on that and follow that rabbit hole down. And yeah, you're all already signed up for the gathering in a couple of weeks. And even if you just want to come and go, I don't know how this is going to work, I'm just going to sit back and listen, that's okay too. You can come and sort of listen to the conversation until you're ready to participate and join into it. All right, is there anything else?
There's one last point that I'd like to make, in that the next learning session will be led by Isaac Crosby from Evergreen Brickworks in Toronto, and that's on November 5th. So you still have to go onto the organiclandcare.ca Souls website to register for that event. So that again is November 5th.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming out. And also, once the video is posted, it will be like it's going to be online, so you can share it. So if there's anywhere you're like, somebody else should hear this, or I want to share that, go for it. I spent some time working on this, so the more people who can see it, the better. All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Okay.